We started off in kind of we started off a few weeks ago with the kickoff of Lent, but last week it was kind of most in earnest that we started to dive into this subject area that we're calling beneath the surface. How we need to really surrender everything to God. And that means sometimes those things that are in the deepest, darkest corners of our identity, which we would rather not let anybody know about, and for that matter, we would rather ignore ourselves. And so we've been using this image, right, of the iceberg. And so we had our iceberg from last week, and we traced it all out and said that there's stuff going on beneath the surface. And so we'll go to the next slide and let you see that. And we said there's all that stuff going on, and we have to learn, if we want to experience real transformation in our lives, we have to submit that all to Jesus. And that's when there it is. We got to go into every aspect of our lives and surrender that to God. And that means we have to be willing to go beneath the surface and challenge those things that have apparently shaped us, whether we were aware of it or not. And they've all contributed to who we seem to be right now. But this has all been about a path that we've been walking, whether we've realized it or not. And that path is that we get to make choices. Those choices are always going to result in some form of an action. If a whole bunch of actions happen, that turns into a habit. Habits become desires. Desires end up becoming our character. And then our character leads us to our destinies. And that means we define those destinies all the way back at the beginning with those choices. But the thing is, these choices aren't just about, should I go left here or right there? It's not like, should I take the road less traveled? Good book, I highly recommend it. But it's not just about that. Some of the thoughts that the things that we need to be thinking about and the choices we make are actually happening at the thought level, like, is this really how I should feel about this right now? We're going to get deeper into how it is we end up having our own sense of emotion and where God fits into that. And that's the problem, is that we've habitually not included God in that process. And that's really what we're here to do, is to include God in the process of how we make our choices in everything. And so that's really about the transformation that we're after. And that transformation is really what God has always been about. We're going to start off in Ephesians chapter 4 today. In Ephesians chapter 4 at verse 21, Paul writes this: "Since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy." We are talking about transforming ourselves, or rather God transforming us into what He's always meant for us to be in the first place. And then in order for that to happen, we have to kind of accept who we are in the first place. And that who we are, as Paul wrote, has been kind of shaped by lusts and deceptions. St. Augustine said it this way. He was 4th century, actually 400 AD is when he wrote a book called The Confessions of St. Augustine. Now go figure, this guy is considered a bishop, a big figure who shaped a whole lot of Christian thought and still affects us today. And he wrote an entire book titled The Confessions of St. Augustine, which is all about how messed up he was and continued to be. And this is what he had to say. He said, "How can you draw close to God when you are far from your own self?" He later went on to say, "Grant, Lord, that I may know myself, that I may know thee." So he's realizing that in order to have a relationship with God, in order for that transformation to really happen, he's got to open himself bare, which means he's got to be willing to face what's in there. A Dominican monk actually wrote in the 13th century, he said, "No one can know God that does not first know himself." And then the reformer, John Calvin, he was writing in 1530. He was about a generation after good old Martin Luther. He wrote this: "Our wisdom consists almost entirely of two parts, knowledge of God and ourselves. But these are connected together by so many ties, it's not easy to determine which of the two proceeds and gives birth to the other. So what he's saying is that somehow there's a tangling of who we think we are and who we really are and where God is in all of that. And if we don't include God in the process, then other forces will assert themselves into defining our identities. And I have an example of that from a 2015 Super Bowl commercial. Let's go ahead and roll film.
Hi, Aaron. Show me what it looks like to run like a girl.
My hair.
Show me what it looks like to fight like a girl. Now throw like a girl.
Aw.
So do you think you just insulted your sister?
No. I mean, yeah, insulted girls, but not my sister.
My name is Dakota, and I'm 10 years old.
Show me what it looks like to run like a girl. Throw like a girl. Fight like a girl. What does it mean to you when I say run like a girl?
It means run fast as you can.
Those young women have something going for them that the world fully intends to take away. And then we saw that when they brought on older ladies who asked the same questions and how they reacted to it. Now, that's just one example, but the deal is all of us have that happening to us all the time. There is something that has initially been wired into us. Remember, God made us good, very good. But then, if we are not paying attention to what's going on, the world comes in and says, no, this is really what you're supposed to be all about. And the most insidious thing about this false self is that we actually believe as it's happening that, oh, this is just, me finding my natural self. This is me truly coming out to be who I have always been meant to be. No, if you didn't include God in the process, that is not what's happening. We're going to take a look at a big chunk of scripture today, and I want you to listen carefully. Last week, we covered King Saul, and Saul was affected deeply by what people thought of him. And so he was making bad choices and not obeying God's direction in his life because he was worried about what other people would think. Now we're going to take a look at David. David comes next. Now, David, we all know, David has some issues, and he's going to make plenty of mistakes over the next several chapters. But there is something about David. He is a man after God's own heart, as it says. And so as we read this passage, I would like you to listen very carefully for a pattern. And that is, David experiences something, and then he reacts to it. And we want to think about those reactions and how it is he chose to react the way he did. So the first action you don't get to see in the reading, I'm just going to tell you about it. David has shown up where there's this big battle happening between the Philistines and the people of Israel. And it's not really much of a fight because they're just standing on either side of the valley yelling back and forth at each other for like 40 days at this point. And what they have been doing is there's this guy, Goliath. Everybody knows Goliath. Goliath stands about 9 feet tall. He carries a javelin that weighs more than the average person. And he's this larger-than-life character who comes out and taunts the Israelites and says, hey, is one of you willing to come out here and get me? And just immediately before the passage, the word is out that if anybody was willing to face him and defeat him, King Saul will hey, you can have one of my daughters, you can have a bunch of money, you can have a place in the court. It's going to be wonderful, but nobody's willing to do it. So he's just come out and done his taunt as we pick up at verse 27. David asked the soldiers standing nearby, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway? That he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God. And these men gave David the same reply. They said, yes, that is the reward for killing him, referring back to, you get all this stuff from the king. But when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing around here anyway?" he demanded. "What about those sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." "What have I done now?" David replied. "I was only asking a question." He walked over to some others and asked the same thing and received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I will go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You are only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." But David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "When a lion or a bear come to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears. I will do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord, who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear, will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul finally consented. "All right, go ahead," he said. And may the Lord be with you." Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. "I can't go in these," he protested to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them in his shepherd's bag. Then, armed with only his shepherd's staff and a sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. I'm going to stop right there. So David goes across the valley to fight this Philistine, Goliath, with a couple of, 5, let's be specific, 5 smooth stones and a walking stick. He's a teenager, and he's going to go face Goliath. Now, Goliath looks out and says, "What the heck is going on here? This is what you guys are going to send out to come after me? Oh, this is ridiculous." And David is absolutely defiant. And so well, we all know how the story goes, right? The Philistine, Goliath, ends up taking a rock right between the eyes, and he goes down. David then stands over him, and if that hadn't already done the trick, he manages to muscle up his sword. That would be Goliath's own sword, and finish the deal. Wow. So what's going on here? What did we see in terms of David and his emotions through this whole thing? First off, David didn't understand why the people of Israel weren't confident in facing Goliath. He's like, "Come on, we worship the one true living God. Isn't this going to be easy?" Well, maybe you would say that David was naive. Okay. Saul agrees to let David do this fight, but here's the thing. When Saul finally agrees, what does he do? He says, "Well, in the world, we have ways of handling these circumstances and situations. So let me put a helmet on you and let me put this armor on you." David says, after putting it on, "Wait a minute. This is not what God has trained me to be in. This is not what I've been prepared for all this time. And you know what? If I do it your way, it's not going to end well. I need to do it the way God has trained me. And while that might seem inadequate, I'm going to have to trust that God is going to finish the deal and fill in the gaps." The issue of the 5 stones. So why 5 stones? Nobody can say for sure, but I'm going to throw out a guess. The first 5 books of the Bible are the Pentateuch. They are the books of the law. And so these 5 stones could just be a tell to us that this is David being faithful and committed to God, saying, "You know what? I'm going to trust in him," and that's what the books of the law are all about, is trusting in God. But let's go just a little bit deeper. When David was challenged by his brother at the very beginning, his brother charges him for being arrogant. He's like, "What are you doing here? You just want to see the fight and stir up some trouble. No, go away." I don't know about you all, but there's a very, very fine line between arrogance, which is what David's being accused of, and confidence. In fact, it's really hard to tell the two apart. I've been trying to coach my daughter on this because that's what you're going to find when a guy meets you for the first time. They're going to put on an air of confidence. Well, there's a big difference between the two at the end. One is a fake and the other one's genuine. And we, by the way, are all guilty of the same thing, where we will put on an air that tries to cover up for our own weaknesses. David doesn't seem to be doing that. And then, of course, as we've already said, he wasn't going to be influenced by the temptation to use a sword, but rather to stick with how he was basically trained by God to handle these circumstances. Each one of David's interactions had an emotion that went with it. Let's think about it for a minute. He hears the taunting of Goliath, and David's response reflects to us an emotional response. He was angry. He was disgusted. Why is this Philistine mocking the people of Israel and especially our God? When nobody would volunteer, then he gets angry again and is disgusted and embarrassed that why? The people of Israel, you guys be confident in this. What's wrong? His brother comes to put him down, and he's surprised, it would seem, that his brother would try to distract from the real situation of Israel getting ready to be sacked by the Philistines. And then finally, as he stands before Saul, he stands there with power and courage, this teenager who's made a choice in all of these. Now, none of these emotions are explicitly identified in the text. The only emotion is his brother is angry, grabs that word. But we can see those emotions based on how David reacted in each sense. And we can also imagine how if he had had different emotions, how the story would have been very different. Imagine David is standing there and hears the taunt from Goliath, and he's afraid. He's full of fear. And then he turns to the people around him, the soldiers, and wonders, will any of them volunteer? And none of them are willing to volunteer. And you could imagine he could feel sadness, like, wow, I'm scared of this guy, and now I'm sad to realize that all of these seasoned warriors around me, they're scared too. Then when his brother comes and makes fun of him and tries to taunt him a bit, he could have been embarrassed and full of shame and said, you know what, you're right, I need to go home. And of course, if all of those things had happened, he wouldn't have found himself standing in front of Saul. What happened for David in each one of these senses is that there was an event, and he had a thought, and that thought then led to the consequence that we read, the emotional reaction. Anybody who's taken the resiliency class with us is going to recognize the graphic that's about to go up on the screen. And it's just this: an activating event is anything that you see, hear, taste, smell, feel in any way from the five senses. You perceive that, and then you're going to have an emotional response. That's the consequence. But in the middle there is the bubble. There's a thought. There's a thought as to how we process what we're experiencing. You can take it down. A good example of this is if I put a picture of any random president from the last few years, in this room there would be different emotional responses that would result from that because of the thoughts you have associated with those images. They're just lights spread up on a screen, but you would feel something, and that's because of a thought that fires in your brain in between. What I am saying about what God is doing for us and where God is inviting us to feel challenge is that we need to spend time surrendering those thoughts to God. Asking ourselves what those thoughts even are, because more often than not, we're not paying attention to them. This is actually kind of fun. There was a study, a bunch of folks were talking about what does it mean to be self-aware. And so they decided to put together a kind of a questionnaire where they would ask people, and they would get a score between 1 and 100, 100 being the most absolute, completely self-aware person ever, and 0, of course, being like, I don't know, a gnat. And they developed their questions thinking, okay, this is going to work, and we're going to get a good spread. And so then they went out to a few thousand people and tried their quiz. Well, here's what happened. The average score, the average person's self-awareness was right around 12 out of a scale of 100. The best they were able to get with their system was in the low 30s. Okay, they revised the system so that way they could get some people up into the 75 to the 100 range. But the truth be told, what they realized is how self-aware we are not. And so we get to stop and say, Lord, how is it that I'm supposed to know you better if I really have no clue as to what's going on in me? And think about that. When you realize that you have an emotional reaction to all sorts of things that just snaps and happens, and you ask yourself, where did that really come from? The thing about that thought bubble that I showed you a minute ago is that it comes with a whole bunch of other stuff. Those things that we described in the iceberg last week that have clung to us over the years, that we've latched onto, that we have allowed to define ourselves. And so suddenly, when you're in a situation, that thought reminds you of that one time, a long time ago, and the next thing you know, you might be really reacting to an event from 10 years prior. That's what's happening in your heart. How do we find that and define it? Is we have to ask ourselves the question, where did that thought come from? So that's going to be the challenge for us in the next, well, truth be told, the rest of your life, if you haven't already taken it up, is how do you look in the mirror and look into those thoughts and say, why do I think the way I think? How did I come to that? Here's the gift, and it's this, that the first thought that fires through your mind, resulting in an emotion, is it's just there. You really can't do much about it. It's how the iceberg is formed around you. But guess what? You still get to make a choice. Before you react to that thought, you get to ask yourself about it. Okay, what am I really wanting to do here? I have a not-so-quick story. I'll try to make it quick. I got a phone call a few years ago while I was working with the Corps of Engineers. It was from a disgruntled member of the public. And, oh yeah, there's a couple of them out there. And he had worked his way through the entire office staff, complaining about a concern he perceived adjacent to his property. Now, people had gone out. For those who don't know, I was working for the Corps of Engineers doing the protection of water resources and specifically washes. And this guy had a wash that was going by his property that the HOA had to go in and maintain every now and then. Otherwise, it would start flooding and ruining people's backyards. But he was concerned that the HOA was doing something wrong and that they shouldn't be back there at all. And we investigated. We made sure that they were in compliance with all that stuff. So it was really kind of a non-issue, and we were trying to explain it to him like, we appreciate your concern, but it's really okay, and it's actually a good thing. You should be all right with it. Oh, he didn't want to hear that. So he had worked his way through several regulators trying to find a new answer for himself. And then he found his way to me. And as he was talking to me, I was trying to walk him through the process and explain, and he was getting more and more irritated. But I was feeling pretty fine about the conversation until he said this. He said, "You know, you are just a typical government employee, worthless and sucking our money dry." So here's the thing. At that stage in my career, I'd been working for the federal government for over 20 years. And I got to tell you, in case you're inclined to agree with the guy, with the exception of the DMV, that is totally not true. Most of the government employees I work with are the absolute most dedicated people I have ever met. They are definitely treated badly on a regular basis, and worse yet, they have to deal with the schizophrenia of their senior-most boss changing names every 4 or so years and all policies with it, and then you're branded guilty with whoever that person is. And they're just like, leave me alone so I can do my job, and in this case, protect water resources. This guy punched my button. And he actually found it, and he stayed on it for about 3 minutes. He kept pounding the button for me. And I was trying to be patient, but I was losing it. I didn't, as I've explained to you what was going on in my mind just now, I was not consciously aware of that in the moment. I was just saying, I've got to stick to my script. Man, I'm getting angry, but I've got to stick to this and try to help this guy understand. Man, I'm getting really angry. And no, I'm going to try to explain because my job is to help explain. Man, I am getting really angry. And then it happened. I was going to tear the guy right through the telephone. Now, I happened, by God's grace, to be using one of those headsets, with the wire thing to it. Not that he would have known this, but I stood up, because if you're going to give a person a proper thrashing, you stand up to do it. I stood up, and as I did, the cord popped and hung up the call. In that moment, I thanked God for calling timeout. I took a few deep breaths, plugged it back in, much to my dismay, called him back and apologized for being disconnected, and then let him rant for another 5 minutes about how federal employees are the laziest, worthless people out there, and that I was going to let his problem continue, and he was just going to give up. Understanding that thought that was going on in my head, if I could have grabbed onto it sooner, I could have actually been honest with the man about it. Could have paused the conversation and say, listen, I'm not going to be able to change your mind about this, but I do need to let you know that I'm getting really frustrated here too. And I would appreciate it if you at least deal with me with a certain measure of respect. I could have said that and been honest, and who knows where the conversation would have gone, but that would have required me to be emotionally mature in that moment, and apparently I wasn't. So as we dig into these things, we get to stop and ask ourselves some of the questions and some of the myths that we may be buying into, and some of those lies that we believe about ourselves. And so I'd like to put a warning out there. There are a couple of ways that we might try to handle this discovery of self. And the first myth is that we might say to ourselves, hey, God has wired me the way I am, and so I should just go with my heart. Now, that video illustrated the fact that maybe when God created us and we were good and very good, things were great. But as we've grown and matured, something has gotten in there and changed us from what those little girls believed to what they then perceived of themselves later in life. And we are already guilty of all that ourselves. So this whole idea of going with our heart is one that's potentially fraught with danger. That's not to say that God doesn't speak to us through our feelings and emotions. He absolutely does. But He speaks to us in part through our feelings. If we completely surrender them to them and go with our heart, as they say, then things can go terribly wrong. There is a motto out there, to thine own self be true. You've heard it. In fact, there was a terrible movie from the 90s actually, 1990s, Danny DeVito, Renaissance Man. Don't watch that movie, it's terrible. The motto of that movie was built on that, to thine own self be true. And so, great, what does that really mean? First, we have to go back to the play itself. Believe it or not, I took every Shakespeare class ASU had to offer. Dr. Dobler was the professor. I loved Shakespeare. I could speak iambic pentameter just fine at the time. I didn't get good grades because I was a lazy writer. But anyway, Polonius is the character in the play Hamlet that actually says that line, to thine own self be true. And Polonius is the fool. He is the guy that's been dispensing ridiculously horrible advice throughout the entire play. And he says, to thine own self be true, and the whole play ultimately is a breakdown of what does that really, really mean. So Hamlet, by the way, he's told at the very beginning of the play, hey, avenge your father's death. His dad appears to him as a ghost, and so he avenged me. And Hamlet spends the rest of the 5 acts trying to figure out, wait a minute, is this real? And did that person actually kill my father? And he goes down this journey of madness and then back out of it. But Polonius ends up getting killed in the play, by Hamlet no less, we don't need to get into it. He got what he kind of had coming to him. And but then his son ends up saying, hey, I gotta avenge my father's death because to thine own self be true. And Laertes is his name. He ends up getting killed at the end of the play. And as he does, his last line is, I am justly killed by my own treachery. Because he blindly was going out to seek revenge. He didn't stop to self-evaluate. Hamlet was self-evaluating the whole time. And so the funny point to this is that thine own self be true is actually a trap. If we just go with our gut on things, that's probably not what God's calling us to do. And we just heard about it this last week as we began our study of the book of Judges. Pastor Paul jumped to the tail end, and the very last line in the book of Judges is, everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. And Israel was in a very, very dark place. The other extreme on this is that emotions are bad and that we shouldn't listen to any of them. That's swinging the wrong direction, or maybe the right direction, but way too far. And so we swing and say, hey, we're going to try to be like Spock and have no emotions at any time and just look at everything rationally. Or there's a more modern version of this, which is, no, there is one emotion that is allowed, and that's any emotion that brings you joy. any circumstance, rather, that brings you joy. That one's allowed. But you can't feel sadness. You don't want to feel shame. You don't want to feel guilt. You don't want to feel any of the rest of that stuff. Avoid that stuff at all cost. This is really not good, because God is a God of emotions. God speaks to us through feelings, and he himself is a being who feels. At the very beginning, during creation, God kept declaring this was good and this was very good. In Genesis chapter 6, when things are starting to go sideways, it says that God was deeply troubled by what the humans were doing. In Exodus 20, God describes himself as a jealous God as he sees the people of Israel choosing to reject him and worship false gods. And then in Jesus himself, Jesus shows us the entire spectrum, everything from anger to love and true love that goes all the way to a cross and sacrifice. Emotions aren't a bad thing. They just need to be in relationship with God. And so here's kind of our call to action. 1 John chapter 4, verse 1 says, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test spirits to see whether they are from God." So when we have feelings, emotions, thoughts come through our minds, we just need to submit those to God and test the Spirit and ask God, is this your call for us? There are kind of 3 specific temptations I want to ask you to watch out for in this next week especially. And the first temptation is to define yourself on the basis of your performance. I am what I do. So we've all probably been guilty of that. I am a pastor, at least I am today. I was a biologist. That was a few days ago. But if we define ourselves on the basis of what we're doing at any given moment, that can change. We all know that. And so suddenly we find ourselves with a definition of ourselves that is very, very tenuous. Worse, though, is that we might grab onto a definition that the world has impressed upon us that does not build us up at all. I have had some friends that have spent time as guests of the state, as you might call it. I am a convicted felon, they might say. I am a thief. I am a liar. I am an addict. When you define yourself by those things, then you let those things have power over you. What we need to do is say, no, I am a child of God who happens to have made some mistakes. I am a child of God who is thankful for God's forgiveness in my life because I realize I habitually make mistakes. I am a child of God seeking to serve God in the best ways I know how. The second temptation to watch out for is to define yourself on your possessions. I am what I have. I remember for some reason being a little kid watching Looney Tunes, and there was Elmer J. Fudd. And he said, "My name is Elmer J. Fudd, millionaire. I own a mansion and a yacht." And he said it over and over again in the episode. And this was a cartoon character defining himself by his possessions. And for whatever reason, it made an impression on me. And I can still quote it today. I was 4 years old when I saw that cartoon. But we do the same thing. We will define ourselves on the basis of the stuff we have, the place we live, the cars we drive. I must be on top of things because I have stuff. Or you might go the opposite direction. You define yourself on the basis of what you don't have. And again, you're missing the point. And finally, the third thing to watch out for, and I think this is the one that's the most insidious today, is that we define ourselves on the basis of what other people think. And the world, I've already said, is doing everything it can to tell you what you should think of yourself and what you ought to be. We need to be trusting in God. So here's the assignment, that we need to develop our authentic self. We need to pay attention to our interior and submit that to God. And that's going to be kind of step one, is to be sensitive to what we're thinking and what's going on inside our hearts spiritually. 2 Corinthians chapter 13, beginning about halfway through verse 5, the Apostle Paul says, "Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves." So just as we test spirits, we should be testing ourselves, looking in the mirror and asking questions. Lord, what's going on? The next thing, find a trusted companion. You know, we need friends that can stand there and lift us up when we need to be lifted up. we also need a friend every now and then that can knock us down when we need to be knocked down. It says in Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Next, move out of your comfort zone. Isaiah 42:9, this is one of my favorite passages. This is the English Standard Version. It says, behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, let me tell you of them. God is always about change. And we need to be good with change. And the thing is, most of us here are fine with change. I am totally cool with change. As long as you all are changing to the way I think you ought to change to, I think change is a great idea. No, it's about moving off of our dime to someplace new. And that is all about being obedient to God, listening carefully to Him. And that's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard, which is why you need to do this fourth thing. Pray for courage. Deuteronomy 31, verse 6. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. This exercise of going beneath the surface, of questioning every thought that we have and submitting it to God, seems tedious, but the truth is, that's just an excuse. It seems scary. Because we might actually question a whole lot of things about where we are and how we've ended up here. And we might see that God might be calling us to a different direction. We might like the direction we've been on all this time, but that's in part because we've convinced ourselves that we've had to. I'm going to end with Ephesians chapter 1, halfway through verse 16. I pray for you constantly, asking God, the glorious Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, to give you spiritual wisdom and insight so that you might grow in your knowledge of God. I pray that your hearts will be flooded with light so that you can understand the confident hope He has given to those He called, His holy people, who are His rich and glorious inheritance. We are God's inheritance, and we get to open the eyes of our hearts and see things as God sees them, which means seeing ourselves as God sees us. That transformation is what makes a difference in our lives and the lives of those around us, and that's what we're praying for. That's going to mean digging into that below the surface, ice cold water, not fun stuff, but we get to trust that God is there with us. We get to live knowing that as we surrender each element of our lives to God, that He transforms us into being what we were always intended to be, an absolutely unique creation of His. So let's go about that journey of looking in the mirror, not just at the reflection we see back at us, but what lies deeper than that, and surrender it to God. Please pray with me. Heavenly Father, we just lift up to you right now our hearts laid bare, knowing that we really don't want to let go, but we know that our fears don't stand a chance when we recognize that your love is about healing and restoring us. So that's where we need to stand, Lord, with our eyes fixed on your light and standing in your love and your presence. And as we surrender ourselves to you and allow those hurts, hang-ups, habits, those things that we have formed in ourselves or allowed to be formed around us, Lord, when we surrender those things to you, we can watch our fears be washed away by your love and trust that you will transform us into a child of God. It's in Jesus' name we pray.